Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to continue with our look at what's happening in terms of the global economy. That there's been a few developments and a few articles that are very interesting to look at in terms of understanding what is happening out there in the world economy and then how is it going to affect the Australian economy. So in this video I'm going to show you some articles that are worth looking at, tell you where to focus and how you can use it in your exam responses, in discussions, in showing how knowledgeable you are about economics. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so in this document, as you can see, I've got 6 links to articles, and I'll put all the links in the description below. Each of these articles deals with something that is happening in the world economy right now. So what I'll do is I'll just take you through each one in turn and you can follow along as I'm going through. So the first one is from the BBC. It talks about how global growth forecast is cut by the IMF amid trade tensions. So before we get into some of the elements of the article, why don't we break down this heading a little bit. So global growth forecast, that's that kind of expectation or judgment of what economic growth is likely to be on a global level. And that here we're talking about how it's been cut, it's been reduced, it's been brought down by the International Monetary Fund. And one of the big reasons for that is that the trade tensions between China and the US, that is going to be taking away from global growth. So if we scroll down this article a little bit, that we can see here that the IMF predicts growth of 3.2% over calendar 2019, which is actually slightly down from what it was thinking in April. Growth is set to pick up 3.5% in 2020, but that is down from what it was expecting previously. And if we scroll down here, we can see that in this paragraph here, which might be useful to include in some of your responses, that it says the principal risk factor to the global economy is that adverse developments, so negative developments, including further US-China tariffs, so that US-China trade war, the possibility of each country imposing tariffs on each other's products and reducing global world trade, US auto tariffs, or a no-deal Brexit. So a no-deal Brexit, so Brexit, that's Britain's move to leave the EU, which has been voted for in Britain, but it's been a very challenging process to try and organise it. So here it's saying if there is no deal on Brexit, all of these things put together are going to sap confidence, so reduce confidence, weaken investment, dislocate global supply chains. So what that means is that if tariffs are being imposed, then companies might have to move elsewhere and change how they manufacture and sell products, and severely slow global growth below the baseline. The baseline not being the end of court in a basketball court, but the baseline being kind of that lowest expected case. So I think this is quite interesting in terms of looking at the International Monetary Fund is saying these things could result in slower global growth. So I find that interesting. If we then look here, we could see here a little bit, we're going to expand on this idea. It says here, IMF trade conflicts could worsen sluggish global economy. My students will tell you I really do like the words sluggish and subdued very much. So you can see here, this is from CNN Business. It says IMF says trade conflicts could make a sluggish global economy even worse. So sluggish like a slug, moving very slowly. So what we're saying here is that the IMF, just looked at what they were saying, that the IMF thinks that that trade conflict, that trade war, could actually make weak global growth even weaker. And that's going to be a really challenging situation. If we think about some ways to demonstrate this here, what we can say here is that if the current tariffs continue to be in place, so the tariffs between China and the US, and if there is further escalation that includes all of the trade between US and China, then that would shave off about 0.5% from the level of global GDP in 2020. And that's the IMF's chief economist making that comment. So again, that trade war really creating substantial risks for the global economy. If we scroll down a little bit here, we can see that even though there are these global challenges, that one brighter spot is the US economy, right? The IMF has upgraded its expectations for 2019 growth to 2.6% from 2.3%. So even though the global picture is a bit pessimistic, that there are pockets of optimism, including the US economy. So what we've done is we've had a look at IMF. In terms of the situation and what it could cause individual economies to do, can you see here we've got Fed could cut rates for the first time in a decade. Fed is like a short way of describing the US Federal Reserve, which is America's central bank, like Australia's Reserve Bank. So if we have a look at this article, which comes from Reuters, that you can see here is that the point is that a quarter-point Federal Reserve interest rate cut in July is almost a done deal. So it's almost a certainty, according to economists who were surveyed by Reuters, a news agency, and these economists expect another rate cut later in the year amid rising economic risks from the ongoing US-China trade war. So the idea here is that the Fed in America is likely to cut the official cash rate not once but twice. They call it the Fed funds rate, not the cash rate, but it's the same thing. So that America is expected to cut rates not once but twice over 2019 in response to the risks of a global slowdown, in part due to the trade war. So if we have a look a bit deeper into this article, it talks about how Fed rate expectations, so expectations of what the US Federal Reserve will do with official interest rates, have taken a U-turn this year. So they're going this direction and they've turned around and gone the other way, going to a holding pattern earlier in the year from a steady tightening path expected beforehand to a series of cuts. Whoa, interesting here. Basically, what happened was that there was expectation that the US might be in a position to start raising rates because the economy was becoming more stable and things were looking better. But here it's changing to expectations from economists that the Fed funds rate will be cut. And it will be cut in part to deal with that uncertainty in the global economy. So just as Australia has been cutting interest rates, it's quite possible that America could see that situation as well, which is a big shift from what economists initially expected America would do. Okay, if we keep going through our economic update, we can see here that if we compare official interest rates around the world, that this is as of July 2019, that Australia has a cash rate of 1%, the US has a cash rate of 2.5%, and that is as of late July. And then if we look at the Eurozone, that the Eurozone has essentially a lending rate of 0 and a deposit rate which is negative, that savers are not getting anything on their savings. So if we have a look here at the chart in terms of the Euro area interest rate, so the EU level interest rate, you can see here that interest rates have essentially been at 0 going back to 2016. That the monetary policy has been very expansionary or loose in that environment to try and get that area growing. So what I'm sort of saying here is that there is a global picture of much more expansionary or loose monetary policy encompassing now America, EU going back for a number of years, and Australia also going back for a number of years too. And that you can use these numbers to demonstrate the concern about the potential state of the global economy and how central banks are trying to address that. Okay, so again, all those links if you want to follow up more on some of those there. If we look at here, if we then think about, okay, well, what does this all mean for Australia, right? These are all global developments, but we are being asked to write and focus on the Australian economy. So what does it mean for Australia? And essentially what it means, I think in terms of the most important or the headline, is that Australian official interest rates could go lower. So if we have a look at this article from ABC News, that it's looking at the Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Philip Lowe, and this is a picture of Philip Lowe here. So this is a speech given by the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe, and the link will be in the description. That you can see here what it's talking about is in the current context of inflation that has been below target. So remember, the RBA's target band for inflation is 2 to 3% over the course of the business cycle. With unemployment showing early signs of rising amid a steep home building downturn, Mr. Lowe explicitly said further interest rate cuts are possible, so that the cash rate in Australia could go even lower. So you can see this quote here from the governor: if demand growth is not sufficient, so if aggregate demand is not strong enough, the board, as in the RBA board, the group that makes the decision about the cash rate each month, is prepared to provide additional support by easing monetary policy further. So that's sort of code for saying cut the cash rate even lower. What I think is interesting as well is to keep an eye on this kind of issue here, where he says, however, as I've discussed on other occasions, the other arms of public policy could also play a role in this scenario. This is a very clear mention of fiscal policy. So if monetary policy is super expansionary, why is the government still budgeting for a surplus? Why isn't it trying to spend more money, increase government spending, boost aggregate demand to help work together instead of against monetary policy at the moment? But what we can say here is that whether or not further monetary easing is needed, it is reasonable. So it is likely to expect an extended period of low interest rates. So they're not going to be going up anytime soon, according to the RBA governor. Just one more point before we finish up in this video, and this is looking at the global economy, really, the whole situation, including Australia, is that this idea is that low interest rates could be a real problem. And let me show you exactly what I mean. So there's this very interesting New York Times articles about how global recession risks are up and central banks aren't ready. And you can see here this paragraph. It says here that monetary policy is also running low on credibility. Major central banks have failed to hit their 2% inflation targets during this expansion, so this recent economic expansion, heightening the risk that prices will slip dangerously low come the next downturn. This is what I think is the really important part here. And while promises of lower for longer interest rates have been a major source of stimulus in recent years, and what this means is that lower interest rates encourage spending because they discourage saving and also encourage borrowing, so they're stimulating the economy, those pledges might lose some of their punch in a world where investors already expect permanently low interest rates. So if interest rates are low and people expect them to continue to be low, they lose some of that expansionary power that investors and shoppers and and consumers, are not as motivated by interest rate cuts because interest rates are already really low. It doesn't change their behavior much at all. The other point to think about, which ties back in with what we were saying with Philip Lowe, is this idea of that central bank leaders have increasingly warned that their firepower will be limited without help from fiscal authorities, so that the ability to fix the economy needs more help from fiscal policy in terms of the government's responses, not just the central banks. Okay, so hopefully this was a useful video. All of the links will be in description. Please, any questions, comments, put them well in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.